Hello and welcome. Hi, my name's Dave, and today I'm talking about the top 10 biggest beginner mistakes that I've seen while teaching web development for the last several years. Now, I'm not sharing these mistakes to poke fun or make fun of anyone. I'm hoping to educate by highlighting these mistakes and helping not only my students but anyone starting out avoid them in the near future. Now, we've all made mistakes and we've all been beginners at once, and so I'm sure we can all relate. Hopefully none of us have made mistakes large enough to be seen by a satellite that's orbiting the Earth, but we can all relate to making mistakes. So with that said, let's get started, and we'll start the countdown at number 10. In Visual Studio Code, you can see I have got a HTML page named My Cool Page, but it has spaces between the words my and cool and page. This is something beginners often do, but you want to avoid having spaces in a file name. If we go to Chrome, you can see why. Spaces are not allowed in a URL, so the spaces must be encoded, and you see a %20 every place there was a space, let alone in your code. If you're back in Visual Studio Code and you go to create a link to this page, what are you going to do with the space in there? Spaces are not allowed in URLs. So keep all spaces out of file names when you are creating HTML files and other files as well. It just makes them easier to work with. Case sensitivity is another issue. You can see now I've removed the spaces from mycoolpage.html, but now I've used camel case, so the letter C and the letter P are both capitalized. Likewise, my CSS folder starts with a capital C, and then my CSS file, main.css, starts with a capital M. In my code, however, I'm using all lowercase css/main.css. And now, if I look at the web page, the CSS is applied. I'm just changing the H1 to a color of blue. However, something I frequently get from beginner students is that they say my web page or my project works on my computer, but then when I take it to the server, it doesn't work. And that is because Windows ignores these case sensitivity issues. But when you launch your project on the web, most servers are using the LAMP stack or a variation thereof, which starts out with Linux. That's the L in LAMP. And Linux and Unix systems in general are case sensitive. And that means they will not ignore these case differences. So if it starts with a capital C, it needs to be the exact same way in your code. So the best thing you can do is, of course, pay attention to detail, but also always use lowercase unless there is a tradition or standard that you're following that does not use lowercase. Like I can think of an example, typically classes in JavaScript or class files start with a capital letter. However, that is the exception to almost always using lowercase. So you do not want to have a capital M in main or a capital C in your CSS. Likewise, my cool page, if you need to discern the words, instead of having spaces or using camel case, it would be much easier or better to use my_cool_page to indicate there are spaces or to separate those words rather than trying to use capitals or actually putting spaces in the file name. Okay, we've removed the spaces from our file name and replaced them with underscores, as you see in my_cool_page. We have used lowercase on our directories like CSS and our file names like main.css. And now you can see we have a new directory named img, short for image, and inside it has a rocket.jpg file. And the problem we encounter now that beginners often do is how to link to these files. We quickly learn how to link to CSS that is inside the root folder. We just specify the CSS folder and then look for the file inside of it. But when we're inside the CSS file and we want to link to the rocket image, that's where the trouble usually begins. So let's take a look when we set the background image on the body in the CSS. Since we're in the CSS file, we need to go up to the root directory instead of just looking for the image folder. it's not there. It's not in the CSS folder. So what we need to do is use 2 dots, and that indicates going up a directory. And then we put a slash, and you can see Visual Studio Code now tries to help us out. And we can choose the image directory and the rocket image inside that directory. And we can save that. Now, 1 dot indicates the directory that you're currently in. 2 dots indicates going up 1 directory. And that's a good way to remember that. So let's look at our page now. And you can see we have a rocket as the background image. You can see I've now added an index.html to the project, and that is the mistake that beginners often make. They do not name their default file index.html. Oftentimes you'll see home.html or index_public.html. I've seen many different variations, but you absolutely need to have an index.html, and that is because the web server defaults to that. So let's look, just as I'm using a local server for my dev environment with live server, you can see up here I have to say mycoolpage.html to see this page. But with an index file, we can remove that and it loads as the default. You do not have to specify the page. And that is often why domains such as google.com do not have to have a slash index.html or whatever other type, index.php, index.js, possibly with React and so on. You want an index page, and that is a good lesson to learn early. When you're first learning HTML and even CSS, you can get away with loading your project directly from your hard drive, but you want to break that habit as soon as possible because it's so easy to run a local dev server, and loading files directly from your hard drive will cause problems sooner than later. And I'll show you an example. Notice I have linked to a JavaScript file now, and I'm using the type equals module to load this JavaScript file. And here you can see the JS directory and the main.js file. I don't even have anything in the JavaScript file. I'm just loading it into the index page. Let's go ahead and look at the HTML, and you can see this index page is loaded, and I'll bring up DevTools, and you can see in the console there are no errors for this page whatsoever. Now I've got a blank tab here. Let me load this page from the hard drive. I'll press Control-O, and here's the files to load, and I'll just load the index. It looks like it loaded fine, but now if I press Control-Shift-I to see the DevTools, you can see we have errors here. Loading from the hard drive will cause errors, especially once you get into JavaScript and you're trying to use modules. The type module is not allowed. It is blocked by the CORS policy. You want to use a local dev server. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'll show you how to do that. You want to go into Extensions, and there, search for Live Server. You can install the Live Server extension by Ritwick Day. You can see mine's already installed. I would have to uninstall here. And once you have that, you can launch your live server. Right here in the bottom, you can see mine is listed as running at port 5500. Also, if you right-click on your page, you can just choose Open with Live Server. Now, let me explain the port as well. Back here, not in the file version, but in the live server version, you can see we're running this, and it gives our local IP address and then the port number, 5500. So these two are separate things. Think of this as the hotel or your house. They call it home, essentially. And then the port number that's following the colon here, 5500, that's your room number. That's a good way to remember that. So you've got your IP address, kind of like a street address, and then your room number, which is the port number after it. And that's because you're running a local dev server and it's responding like the web, not loading the page out of your file directory. While we're discussing linking to JavaScript, another common error is to link to a JavaScript file in the head section of the HTML page without using type equals module or the defer keyword. If you use type equals module, like you previously saw me use, it automatically applies defer. If you do not use type equals module, you want to have defer here. Once again, I will show you why. I'll save this without defer or type equals module, and we'll go to the browser. And in the browser, you can see the page is loaded, but I have a null value here. Let me show you why I have a null value. When we look at the JavaScript, you can see I'm selecting the H1 element on the page, and then I'm logging the value of the H1 element, or I'm actually logging the full element, not just the value within it. But we had null, we didn't get the value. And that is because, if we look back at our page once again, the page is loading and the script automatically runs when it gets to the script tag. And our H1 comes after that in the body. And we can see that in the code. But what happens is H1 doesn't have a value yet, so it's null. And if we look at the code again, here's the JavaScript code. But if we look at the HTML and see the order things happen, the script is here before the H1. So we want to defer reading that script. And by applying that, or type equals module, which uses defer as well, then it will allow the rest of our HTML page to load before running the script. And that will make all the difference. So let's go ahead and save this. We'll go back to our page. And now we have a value, an H1 index page value here, because the DOM, the document object model, did load, and we were able to grab the H1 from the body because we deferred our script. I should also add quickly that when you're looking at pages that were created previously before defer was available, you might have seen the script tag at the bottom, somewhere right above the closing body element. And this was another way to do that before the defer keyword existed. So if we load this, H1 will have loaded before we get to the script, and that is also a way to make it work. All too often, beginning development students forget to apply responsive design, and at the same time, most will be looking at websites on their phones more than anything else. And so responsive design is very important, with over 50% of the views, probably far over at this point, coming from mobile devices. So as you can see, I just deleted all the contents of the index.html, but I will show you quickly how to use something built into Visual Studio Code that will apply the meta tag that you need in order to start making your designs responsive. And that is Emmet. So we'll use an Emmet abbreviation by just typing an exclamation mark, and that's an Emmet abbreviation. If we go ahead and click on that, you can see it puts the skeleton for a page right here. And a very important tag in the skeleton is the meta tag with the name equals viewport, and then it has the content has width equals device dash width, and initial scale 1.0. And that's absolutely necessary to make your pages scale and respond to media queries. And so that is the first ingredient of making a project or a web page responsive for all types of devices. While we're talking about responsive design, let's go ahead and talk about what to design for first. And I am a firm believer that you should design for the smallest viewport first. In other words, the smallest phones, and work your way up. Because just like unboxing a package, it's always easier to scale up, in other words, pull the things out of the box, than it is to have all of this design and try to stuff it into a smaller box. I believe that is more difficult. So you want to start with a small viewport and expand your design rather than a large viewport and try to cram it all back into a smaller design. So you can see I've got a basic CSS page here with the body, and then I've got a couple of media queries. And at this point, I'm saying when the width gets to 768 pixels, that's iPad size, go ahead and make the background red. For sizes smaller than that, I've got the background color black. And then once we get to a width of 1024 pixels, I'm turning the background blue, which is an iPad Pro size. And I could go ahead and make a larger size for larger desktop viewports as well and so on. But this is just an example. So we're going from essentially mobile phone design as the default, moving to a normal size tablet and then a large size tablet. So let's look at our HTML. And you can see I've got a phone open here in DevTools, and it's got a width of 414 pixels, and it has a black background. Now let's go ahead and pick an iPad, and the color changes to red. We're at 768 pixels. If I choose an iPad Pro, we've got a blue background. And so you can manipulate the CSS and change things. Of course, this doesn't give an example of taking an elaborate design and trying to cram it into a smaller viewport, and that's what you don't want to do. You want to take a simple mobile design and then add to it as your design is able to expand with media queries. Beginning dev students frequently have messy code. Notice in the HTML I'm using indents, and these were even put in by default when we created this outline of the page with Emmet, and it gave us the page skeleton. And these tabs, you want to take advantage of the spaces and the tabs. They make it easier to read. And so when I added something to the body, I once again indented, and that's in HTML. Let's look at the CSS. There's something I could clean up here from earlier, a little space between each definition bracket. And then notice how my brackets are linking here. When I click and you see the line drawn between them, I'm using an extension to do that, which can help you, especially when things are longer, to see how things are connected. So let's look up that extension that would help you if you installed it in your Visual Studio Code, and it is bracket pair colorizer. Oh, I can't connect to the extensions right now. Let's try that again. Bracket pair colorizer 2. That's the one you want. Go ahead and install that, and you will also be able to click on your different brackets and see the line drawn between them. And that comes in very handy with JavaScript. If you were to have a larger function, as you can see, it also links the curly braces or brackets here. I'm using one other extension, and I wouldn't normally write a function like this. Notice I'm not taking advantage of the indents, but when I save this file, it automatically indented those lines. I'm using another extension called Prettier that also helps clean up any messy code that I might have missed. So back in your extensions, search for Prettier. And it is a code formatter, and you can set it to apply when you save your files, and then it will automatically format those files for you in a uniform and easy to read way. And of course, install that, and you can read more about it here when you add the extensions. But both bracket pair colorizer and Prettier will help you not have messy spaghetti code, and it will be easier for you to find where you're at, let alone somebody else that has to work with your code. And we're ready for the #1 biggest, most common mistake made by beginners. And I wanted to share that one personally while talking to the camera, talking directly to you. What the biggest mistake is something we can all benefit from, even when we're not beginners. And it's just not walking away. We don't take a break. Sometimes our eyes are tired. Sometimes our brains have just lost it and become mush when we're looking at code. We're missing that semicolon, and we just can't find the error. We don't know what the cause is. It's a typo probably, something we spelled wrong, who knows what, and it's driving us crazy, and we've been looking at the screen for hours. Get up. Remember this, definitely beginners, but everybody should remember this. Get up, go get a cup of coffee, take a walk, go for a short drive. You will come back refreshed and be more productive. If you need to, take a nap or just take a break and look at it the next day if it's just driving you so crazy you don't want to see it again, because you need to have a fresh mind. We're talking details here. Writing code is something that is very detailed, and sometimes that detail just escapes us, and even though it's right in front of us, we can't see it. So take a break. That's the #1 mistake that I see beginners get so frustrated, and I get emails from students saying, I just can't see what's wrong. I don't get why this isn't working. Well, it happens to all of us. It really does. So take that break, come back with a fresh mind and really a fresh set of eyes, because that's what will help you get through it. All right, we've reached the end of this top 10, but I know there's many more common mistakes that you're probably aware of too, especially if you're not a beginner, but you're watching this anyway. Leave your comments below, because I would like to know what you think some of the common mistakes are, because we can add to this list in the future as far as that goes, and I want to learn as well. Thank you for watching and subscribing. Please like the video, and I'll see you again in the near future.